Welcome to the second part of this introductory series. I will now focus on the diagnosis of the adult replacement child condition. I will refer to also structural elements of this condition, share with you a myth of Nessus, and read to you a few lines from this year's Nobel laureate in literature, Louise Gluck, who is a replacement child. Welcome to the second part in this series.
Our first challenge is to know, is this what we are dealing with? Hardly anybody comes to your practice and says, I'm a replacement child, I'm someone else. It's very hard to get to in many cases because they themselves don't know. They may not know. We need to figure out how else to come to understand that this is what they are facing or that we are facing it. Many have been searching for their identity, but they may come and not be able to say, I look for my identity. They may say, I feel uneasy, or I look for my roots, or I have low self-esteem, or others are facing an abyss or a fear of the void. These are all metaphors. I have one case about which I will say things at several times. That is Delphine, and she says, I fear that I lose myself, is a little bit what Laureano just brought to our attention. What looks on that first slide like an innocuous t-shirt is mythologically a tunic of Nessus. If you look up that myth, it's the myth of Hercules, Deianira, and Nessus. Nessus is supposed to take the wife of Hercules, Deianira, across a river, ferry her over. He profits of the opportunity to rape Deianira. Hercules throws a poisonous arrow at Nessus. Nessus is about to die and says, take my shirt imbued with semen and blood and give it to your husband, Hercules, in case of waning love. This is what kills Hercules. He's devoured by the flames. He's trying to get it off. He can't. Okay. So replacement children are sometimes also called phoenix children, rising like a phoenix from the fire. And if we look at it with Jungian eyes, it's rising from the fire that purifies, that doesn't destroy, but that purifies, and that takes out, like Jung said, all superfluities. It's a genuine process of purification where all superfluities are consumed in the fire and the basic facts emerge. Also in the Psychology of Transference, paragraph 400. So sometimes they're referred as phoenix children or as rainbow children. Now, diagnostically, as I said, you may have things that you feel, that you see, self-esteem, difficulties with identity, don't know what I want, don't know what I feel. Difficult relationships, I will explain why later. And you have, for a moment, we look at it clinically, you may have depression, anxiety, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The X is one of the DSM-5, or you may have actually traits or elements of personality disorders. X is 2 of DSM-5. You can have borderline elements. You may have narcissistic personality elements, schizotypal. There might even be a psychotic episode. I would like to refer again back to what Laureano said. Sometimes I feel that presence. Some people may hear voices, or they may see a person in a vision or in a dream and not know what that is. So before I go and would consider a psychotic episode, I will check whether this could be one of the things to be considered and causing it. But they are not only symptoms, we are Jungians, they are also symbols. that let us recognize that maybe we are dealing with a replacement child condition. Symbols that point to grief, symbols that point to loss and absence. I already referred to the abyss or the feeling of void. Symbols that show there is a preponderance, a tendency towards dealing with questions of life and death. A symbol can be solitude and existential loneliness. Kierkegaard, one author, very clearly, Edvard Munch, the scream, right, very clearly. They were both replacement children and they grappled and dealt with existential loneliness. Already as a schoolboy, Jung asked himself, what is my notion of self and who is the other? Am I the other or is the other in me? What 15-year-old thinks like that? I think it was on the background of those 3 missing siblings. Others have created from this background, as I mentioned, Beethoven, but also Mahler. And then the recent Nobel laureate Louise Gluck, she just received the prize last week. And I looked at some of her poems and I said, she's a replacement child. I have just no doubt. And then I looked at her bio. And yes, she's born in 1943 after her parents lost a first daughter. And this event has affected her profoundly. And the themes of grief and loss can be seen throughout her work. She writes, her death was not my experience, but her absence was. Her death let me be born. I bring to you a short excerpt from her poem, The Wild Iris, in her anthology, The Wild Iris. And I apologize to the poet because I took away the line breaks so that you can read the whole text with me. Just the excerpts from it. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. Hear me out. That which you call death, I remember. It is terrible to survive as consciousness, buried in the dark earth. You who do not remember passage from the other world. I tell you, I could speak again. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. From the center of my life came a great fountain, deep blue, shadows on azure sea water. Now the iris, if you look at it in the book of symbols of Aras, is a symbol of the many colors. Its iris is actually Greek for rainbow. The many colors, the omnes colores, refer symbolically back to the philosophical stone. It heralds the transcendent self in which the many facets of the personality, once opposing each other, are brought into a unity. It's beautiful just in those few lines. She's condensed what we are dealing with and what we are talking about. I wish to share with you the structural elements which can show us we are dealing with this. I will go in detail in this hour and in the next into attachment and identity, into unconscious grief and guilt, unconscious guilt, and into the images of shadow and the images of anima, anima of other, attachment. This is an image of Egon Schiele, who was a replacement child. I won't go into the details. It will be in my notes. And he painted how a child may feel who is born to a grieving mother, a mother who's lost a child, or a father. I would say that today I have met with many fathers who have been deeply, deeply affected by a loss and found it difficult to attach to a new baby, to a new being, or who held on to that new being. Bowlby, the eminent pioneer of attachment theory, has said that it is the early bonding process in such circumstances is affected and will affect the identity formation of a child. Andre Green is an eminent Freudian psychoanalyst, a French one, said a replacement child can experience a grieving mother as a dead mother who draws the ego towards a deathly, deserted universe. This, I think, is expressed in Egon Schiele's painting 100 years almost before, or say 70 years before. Green, who was himself a replacement child, has formulated this. So the other can be experienced as absent in the attachment process. A parent may wish to see the absent child in the newborn, or may not dare to attach and love this new child, the newborn, for a fear of also losing it. And a baby might find it hard to attach under such circumstances. I quote Bowlby, "Unfortunately, there is no lack of evidence that the loss of a baby can give rise to serious problems later for the parents themselves and for surviving children." We can understand this because the experience of a presence of other is compounded by the experience of an absence of other. The absent sibling or the parent, since grieving, are absent. Now, Andre Green spoke about the dead mother concept, not because the mother is dead, but because the mother is perceived as being dead because she's grieving, because she's absent. And Green said the unconscious identification with the dead mother can result in the constitution of a whole. And the subject is caught between two losses, presence in death or absence in life. So many replacement children have found that in the attachment process, they have found it was a cold and dysfunctional relationship, which then will have a repercussion for relationships later on. The attachment style may not be secure. It may be ambivalent, or it may be hostile, rejecting. So now in Jung, I asked myself, Jung had a good relationship with his mother, but he didn't have a good relationship with his father. Right? And his father kind of lost faith a bit. And I wondered whether there was a connection with Paul, the father, Paul, the child lost, and Carl Gustav wasn't Paul, but that's just an aside. But also Jung's mother spent some time in a sanatorium during his early years, and supposedly because of depression, but she may have also been suffering from grief still. That feeling of loneliness comes when the mother cries behind a closed door. One replacement child, Kara, is born after one that's lost and before another one that will be lost. And she just remembers feeling alone and hearing her mother cry behind the door. One didn't talk about these things that much. She knew, but most importantly, attachment. The point is, this can impinge on attachment. There is a case in the book called Delphine, because Delphine gave me her painting of her self-birth, which I put onto the cover of the book. And she just thought that she had a really good relationship with her mother. She had no idea that she had an ambivalent relationship. She said the first name of the child before her was given to her. And then she chose a new one, Delphine, to give herself an unencumbered identity. And she said, I was so close to my mother. I always stayed with my mother. I couldn't bear being away from her. And once her mother didn't catch the train for which she had run to the train station to fetch her, and her mother wasn't on that train. And she ran home and cried and hid behind the furnace. This is all before mobile phones, of course. And she said, I thought if she does not return, I cannot exist. And May, this is kind of what you were pointing towards. This is what the mother had felt also with respect to the birth of Delphine concerning her earlier child. If that child does not return, I cannot exist. Now Delphine felt it towards her mother. It gets transferred hither and to those feelings of, am I me? Am I the other? Do I exist? Does the other one exist? I cannot exist if the other one doesn't come back. And when her mother passed decades later, Delphine felt guilty. And she says, I wanted that she dies and I wanted that she lives. She loved her mother. But that those intricacies of the attachment, that ambivalence from the very beginning, because of the joining of the archetypes of death and life, that wasn't conscious. And she was very glad that she was in her late 60s and stayed until her mid 70s with me, that she could name it. And this is a painting she did of a figure rising and going towards the light of self, I would think. Identity. I have strong images here. I hope you don't mind. This was brought to me by the daughter of a replacement child. She had found this illustration of this joint feeling of identity by Salvador Dali. Cain and Cain, which is the article from 1964, said these children's identity problems were such that they could barely breathe as individuals with their own characteristics and identity. Its very existence is sometimes a secret. The I refers not to who it is. It doesn't refer to the ego. It refers to an inexpressible non-identity. Or a pseudo-identity, like several of the authors have called it, a pseudo-identity, or some of you who might have read Hester Solomon, the as-if personality, with a sense of a void at the center, a no man's land, a threat to the survival of self. Now, why did I put here Salvador Dali? Because he was a replacement child. He replaced Salvador, who had died 9 months and 10 days before him. So he was conceived 10 days after the death of his brother, and consistently he said that his brother was 3 years younger than him and passed away 3 years younger. This confusion of dates, or the effort to put more time between one and the other, can happen in these cases. It did happen also with Beethoven. Now, he said, the affection was already stolen from me in uterus. He was taken to the cemetery and he was told he was the reincarnation of Salvador I. And what did he do? He made so many paintings. You can't miss a Salvador Dali painting. I could show you paintings upon paintings, but I just want to show you that 60 years after all of this happened, he still made a portrait of his dead brother because it had so impacted his life. He also identified with the Dioscuri, Castor, and Pollux to be immortal and mortal at the same time, but that's another mythological reference. He said, we resembled each other like 2 drops of water, but we had different reflections. And he worked like really very consistently to make himself the one unmistakable Salvador Dali we know. I would like to go to grief with an illustration by another replacement child, Vincent van Gogh, because may you just refer to grief and guilt. Vincent van Gogh is the most studied replacement child because he was born on the exact same day, 1 year later than the first Vincent who had died. They are born on the 30th of March. Our Vincent, whom we know, 1853, the one who left, 1852, and they even took away the birth registration number of the first one and gave it to the second. Things you shouldn't do, and things one should avoid if one can, culturally sensitive. It's possible to not give the same name. So he passed in his childhood. His father was a pastor, the cemetery, which had a tombstone with his name on it. And you can see, I will try and do this with the cursor if possible. Right, this is Vincent van Gogh, and he is a young man, and he is trying to get the attention of his mother. And she's too downcast to meet his gaze. They cannot connect. What we just saw with the dead mother concept, there is not that connection possible because she is not there. Poznansky warned that a replacement child can be a continuing vehicle of parental grief. A veritable inner foreign object, a crypt in the soul is created because maybe even of a non-stated loss, because of a secret, because of a taboo, and an unspoken obligation maybe to even keep silence. Van Gogh has a lot of grief in his life. And I find that even though this is a very bright painting, there is a sort of feeling of melancholy about it. Maybe the color, maybe the trees. He's done many trees, many trees, and very often a branch is missing. You can see this here, a branch is cut off. But still there's a sower who sows new life. And then Van Gogh was trying to deny death. He has said with respect to friends he had lost, or here he is painting the raising of Lazarus from the Bible. And these are the features of Vincent van Gogh, who is to be raised from the dead. We need to pay attention to grieving. Bowlby said, grieve at least 1 year. I don't think it's enough before another conception is planned. It can take a long time to do the grieving process. And like Verena Kast has in her brilliant book on grieving written, grieving gives you back vitality to the parent, but also to a replacement child, because the replacement child may have to do the grieving that wasn't done. It's transferred from the parent, and to do the grieving for some of the loss of relationship and the loss of life until they become conscious. Maybe quickly, grieving entails a full realization of the loss, the acceptance of the loss, the resolution of anger and of guilt, and a withdrawal, as Verena Kast writes, of emotional investment and a reinvestment of that emotional investment in another human being, but a separate one with its own identity, not a stop grief child. So for self-birthing, a replacement child, an adult replacement child, will probably have to go through the grieving. If you notice down her name, she has a beautiful website on the art of grieving. Caroline Mackenzie is a UK artist. I met her 15 years ago when my first paper came out and was transferred to her. And she had created a series of grieving pictures. Her parents had lost a child, a boy before her. Her birth was a disappointment. She was angry. You see that red figure here? She was angry. And then she made a transformational process towards receiving herself again with love, a motherly figure, an archetypal mother, because she had finally reconciled before the death of her mother, but this was way before, and her own inner child. So this is on the internet, and is a great contribution. It's also on the Replacement Child forum, and can show how a process can first express itself creatively. And then she did all the years of the consciousness of seeing what she actually had painted. She had no idea that this is what she had painted. So consciousness and creativity can combine to counter those initial destructive influences. And she worked it through and integrated it. It's great, she says, without this, actually, I wouldn't probably have created as much as I have. I can recognize this now. My wound has led me to my paintings, and she's done beautiful statues, which I will also show you. Guilt. Next element, guilt. Different strands of guilt. Number one, survivor's guilt. I have survived. Why do I live, not the other? Do I live because the other one doesn't? Introjected guilt, a really difficult one. Cain and Cain wrote that unconsciously, and I repeat, unconsciously, parents may hold a replacement child responsible for the disappearance of the other. Even though they've had nothing to do with it, the primary process thinking is this child is here, the other is not. This child is responsible for the other not being. Introjected guilt is a big issue. A feeling can be introjected in a replacement child, making it feel responsible for the disappearance of the other. Because unconsciously, parents may believe that this child, the new child, caused the disappearance of the other. Primary process thinking, this child is here and the other is not, so it's this child's fault that the other one is not. And this is deeply unconscious introjected guilt, identified by Cain and Cain. And in another book by Prophecy Coles is a very, very good example as well. But there's also guilt due to narcissistic rage. The child that's there is maybe never good enough when compared with an idealized, absent other child. And you saw Caroline did that red, angry figure. She was ready to kill. Actually, she expressed in her paintings a little bit that she felt she could kill. She could kill the absent boy, and she could even kill her sister who took attention away from her mother. So that's another point we will get through when we touch shadow in a big way. But there's also guilt, and you see it's moving very slowly, existential guilt for missing out on self-realization if the replacement child stays replacing instead of becoming him or her self. I noticed there is a Cain and Abel complex. It's weird that Cain and Cain wrote this wonderful article. A Cain and Abel complex. Cain, the biblical figure in the Old Testament who slay his brother. God says, your brother's voice is calling out to me. This quote in a book by Janet O'Dallett, a Jungian colleague from Washington State, caught my eye and caught me emotionally to look as deeply as I could into this complex, because it can be a guilt complex. It can have both sides of the victim and of the perpetrator. So this is something we may want to look out for. They could also show up in the shadow of a replacement child. Jung. I always had a guilty conscience. Although I had not in reality done what I was accused of, I felt I might have done it. And he said, I actually felt better when I did do something wrong. And I felt relieved when I had done something wrong. I found myself being guilty and at the same time wishing to be innocent. And then again, somewhere deep in the background, I always knew that I was too. In the shadow, you might find the image of other, of the one who is there and who is not there, of the sibling or of the parent, the absent parent, the image of other being an image of anima or animus. And one French researcher who is called Courbet, he entitled his thesis, Tuer le mort, kill the dead. Because he said, if there is a representation of other in the soul of a replacement child, that representation of other has to be gotten rid of, symbolically, of course. It has to be gotten rid of symbolically. It has to be recognized and to be gotten rid of symbolically. Two examples. One was a colleague who said, now I understand. His supervisors hadn't been able to recognize this. When he had a client who had a dream that he should kill a puppy in a plastic sack. A puppy in a plastic sack? Kill a puppy is pretty bad, isn't it? And in a plastic sack, a puppy, somehow it connotates with a fetus in a uterus, doesn't it? And this client had been told, you wouldn't exist if your brother had not died. And so he had to get rid of this other, of that representation of other within himself. And that was what the dream was bringing to the table. But at the time, neither the supervisor nor the Jungian psychoanalyst knew that this is what it referred to. And I had one client who actually came, and I was inexperienced at the beginning, probably still training. And it was a young man who was a replacement child who was told more or less you wouldn't exist unless the girl before you was stillborn. And he came to my office and he said, I want to kill the people in the park. And I freaked and I made a contract with him. And I said, you don't kill anybody. You call me or you go straight to the hospital if you can't reach me. And I didn't know he was a replacement child. After he had had this fantasy and he shared with me, he had a dream where all of his being sort of flowed down into one mass of red gluiness from his hand and nothing of him remained. And that dream, I said, there is something, go back and ask your mother. And only then he got to know that this was a situation, that a girl had been lost before him, that he had been wished for a girl, that a girl came after him and he was there really for nothing. So that needed to be made conscious.